Welcome back to U.S. Government Explained, the podcast that explains how American government works in clear, simple English. Today's episode is all about political parties in the United States, how they began, how they transformed, and why the modern parties look so different from the parties of the past. To understand American politics today, you really need to understand the story of the two-party system. So let's get started. The United States has had two major political parties for almost its entire history. This wasn't planned by the Founding Fathers, and many of them warned that political parties could be dangerous. But the American election system, a system where the candidate with the most votes wins everything, naturally pushes the country toward two large umbrella parties. Smaller parties almost never win, so voters typically choose the larger party that is closest to their beliefs. Over time, these two big parties became the main way Americans organize political ideas, debate issues, and choose leaders. Political parties began almost immediately after the Constitution was written. Alexander Hamilton led the Federalists, who wanted a strong national government. Thomas Jefferson led the Democratic Republicans, who wanted more power for the states and for farmers. These early parties argued about everything: taxes, foreign policy, and how the United States should grow. The Federalist Party eventually faded away, and the Democratic Republicans split into new groups. One of those groups became the Democratic Party in the 1820s. The Democratic Party began as the party of Andrew Jackson, and originally it supported small government and farmers. The Republican Party began in the 1850s, much later than the Democrats. It was created by people who opposed slavery spreading into new states. That is why Abraham Lincoln, who won the presidency in 1860, was a Republican. It's important to pause here and say something clearly. The Republican Party of Lincoln's time does not look like the Republican Party of today, despite people trying to claim the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. This is true for both parties. Their coalitions and values changed dramatically over the next 150 years. American political parties shift and evolve, sometimes slowly and sometimes suddenly. For much of the 1800s and early 1900s, the Republican Party was associated with business, economic growth, and the northern states. The Democratic Party was strong in the rural South and among white voters who opposed federal civil rights protections. In the early and mid-20th century, Democrats changed direction. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs in the 1930s brought millions of workers, immigrants, and poor Americans into the Democratic coalition. At the same time, many African Americans who had originally supported Republicans because of Abraham Lincoln began voting for Democrats because of these economic programs. But the biggest transformation came in the 1950s and 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. For nearly a century after the Civil War, the South was dominated by Southern Democrats, sometimes called Dixiecrats. These politicians supported segregation, opposed civil rights laws, and worked to maintain systems that kept Black Americans from voting. They were a major part of the Democratic Party's base for decades. But beginning in the 1940s and accelerating through the 1960s, the National Democratic Party began to support civil rights more openly. President Truman desegregated the military. Later, Democratic leaders like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson supported major civil rights legislation. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law, many white conservative Southern voters felt the Democratic Party no longer represented their views. Over the next 2 decades, they gradually moved toward the Republican Party, which began presenting itself as the party of smaller government, state authority, and traditional values. This long shift explains why the parties today have almost the opposite regional coalitions they had 100 years ago. The Democratic Party is now strong in cities, coastal and northern Midwestern states, and among racial minorities. The Republican Party is now strong in the South, rural areas, and among many conservative, religious, white voters. Understanding this transformation is essential for understanding modern American politics. So, what do political parties actually do in the United States? A lot. Parties recruit candidates, raise money, organize presidential primaries, support campaigns, write party platforms that outline their beliefs, and help elected officials coordinate their work in Congress. Unlike in many countries, Americans don't have formal party membership cards. You can call yourself a Democrat or a Republican simply by saying so, although some states require you to choose a party when voting in primary elections. Because each party has to appeal to tens of millions of people, they're not simple or unified. Each party contains many different groups. Inside the Republican Party, you'll find traditional conservatives, religious conservatives, libertarians, and more recently, the populist MAGA movement that grew around the current president. Inside the Democratic Party, there are progressives who want big structural changes, moderates who prefer gradual reform, and blue dog Democrats who are more conservative, especially on economic issues. Understanding these factions helps explain why people within the same party sometimes disagree strongly with one another. Even though the US has almost always had 2 main parties, there are several smaller ones. The Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Constitution Party, and newer efforts like the Forward Party. These parties almost never win major offices because of the winner-take-all election system, but they can influence national conversation. For example, the Green Party has pushed environmental issues into the spotlight, and the Libertarian Party has helped grow conversations about privacy rights and limited government. Some U.S. politicians choose not to belong to either major party and instead call themselves independents. But in Congress, they still have to caucus or align with one party so they can serve on committees, participate in leadership decisions, and even have an office. Senators Bernie Sanders and Angus King, for example, are both independents, but they work closely with Democrats in the Senate. So being an independent doesn't place someone outside the 2-party system. It simply means they're not formally registered with either major party. Political parties shape almost everything about American government, from how candidates run for office to how Congress organizes itself to how policies are debated and passed. Understanding the parties and their changing history helps explain why political debates today look the way they do, and why Americans sometimes talk past each other instead of to each other. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the United States would work better with more than 2 strong political parties? Or is the 2-party system still the best fit for American democracy? Thanks for listening to U.S. Government Explained. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend or leave a review. It helps the podcast reach more learners around the world. Bye.